Hello, law students. This is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we're going to talk about illegal contracts, or I guess more accurately, contracts to undertake some activity that is considered to be illegal. If you're in my class, this corresponds to Unit 19. This is the first of a series of units that we do on what we call the social control of contract. And the idea here is simply that we all, as a general matter, believe in some freedom of contract, that you and I should be permitted to enter into whatever kind of agreement we think is appropriate. But we all also agree that there have to be some limits. Society has set some limits, and those limits are the various defenses that we'll be talking about over the next week or two. The first of them involves contracts that are involve an illegal subject or illegal subject matter. And the general rule here is pretty straightforward. An illegal contract is not enforceable. So what that means is that even if the elements that we talked about previously involving the formalities for formation and enforceability, right, offer, acceptance, consideration, statute of frauds, even if those are satisfied, the alleged breacher, that's usually who the defendant is, will be forgiven from breaching because the contract is said to be unenforceable. So it's a defense to the enforcement of the contract against the breacher. The result of that, of course, is that in the case where the general rule applies, the defendant wins. It's an effective defense. You see this in the Highwayman's case, or the excerpt from that, Everett v. Williams. It's a famous case. There, of course, didn't turn out too well for anyone, but you can sort of see the principle in operation. More interesting than the general rule are the are the exceptions to it. Situations, in other words, where a court will say, well, even though the contract might involve illegal subject matter, we're going to enforce it anyway, or at least hold the defendant liable under it. The first of these exceptions involves the argument that the defendant was not an active participant in the contract. That's the sort of exception that's addressed in the Carroll case, which involves suggestions of prostitution. A second involves the idea that there may be unequal fault as between the parties. One party is much more at fault than the other. The Latin for this is in peri delicto, and that's addressed in the Coma case as well as Karpinski. Pretty intuitive. The idea is that that the party that is asserting the exception says that they're just much less at fault than the other person. A third exception involves equity. The idea that it's just not fair in some cases to apply the general rule. That is to say, to hold a contract unenforceable. You see that in Karpinski. A fourth is that we are concerned about the policy that underlies the criminalization in the first place, and conclude that actually permitting the defense, the general rule, would undermine that policy. You see that, for example, in the Coma case, as well as Karpinski. And so, sort of ironically, there will be situations where an exception actually does a better job of advancing the underlying policy than the general rule, so that enforcement of the contract is justified, even though the subject matter is illegal, because it is consistent with the public policy goal of the criminal statute. A fifth exception involves repentance and repudiation by one of the parties, usually before the illegal activities have occurred. You see that in the Greenberg note case. There's not a lot of complexity in these cases, I don't think, in terms of the underlying concept. What's, I think, sometimes challenging for students is to figure out where to draw lines and how to draw lines. And we'll talk all about that in class more. Until then, that's the real deal.